is going to be. And I do want to thank the Provost's office and Jennifer and Kelly for their support in putting this together and offering the invitation. And also for all of you, because I'm really looking forward to hearing what's going on in your classes and the ideas that I'm going to be able to take away from this evening's conversation. And I've been here for 7 years, and the first thing I just have to say is that it's been a gratifying experience and inspiring every semester to come and teach. I teach world religion, advanced courses in Christianity, courses on religion and the afterlife and whatnot. And on the surface, I mean, this is a pretty challenging environment to be exposing this group of students to the other, so to speak, other cultures, other religious traditions. And again, I'm just inspired, and it's a blessing to see the students grow and really reach and be able to sort of be transformed, and also transform myself as a person in the classroom. And I don't know if I really have wisdom to share at all, but I have a couple of just humble suggestions of things that I try to always keep in mind in the classroom, and take what is useful to you and leave the rest, so to speak. One thing that I have found to be, despite the inspiration of teaching here at USM, to be a little bit cryptic and challenging at times for myself, is the fact that students often are not primed for critical thinking, and they're often quite taken aback when they're asked to reflect deeply about questions of deeper existential value, and also to problem solve, to be able to distinguish good argumentation from argumentation that might not be so useful. And especially in world religion courses, to just take a step back and be able to be reflective about the lenses and assumptions they're bringing to the topic. And so when I push some students, because I tend to have a pretty, loosey-goosey kind of stream of consciousness way of teaching, where I'm posing a question or I'm posing a problem, and it doesn't have a prepackaged solution. And so when students are confronted simply by the phenomenon that there may be different methods, there may be different approaches to solving or delving deeper into a particular issue, again, some students are quite resistant to that. And I always found that to be rather cryptic, because that was precisely where, in a classroom setting, when it would break into discussion and conversation and this kind of free-flowing exchange of ideas, that's when I became excited as a student. And I'm not going to say anything that you're not already familiar, but I think part of the problem, right, is that students are coming to our classrooms without that experience of a classroom situation. So there's sort of this model that they're exposed to. They show up in my class and they're the empty vessels, and here I am, the professor, with the pitcher of information, and I'm going to dump it into their heads, and then they're going to, on various assignments, regurgitate that information back to me. And I do want to say that I think content is important, and nuts and bolts pieces of information and that component of what I'm doing in the classroom is significant. Students should walk out of a world religion course with the knowledge that the Quran is not a Buddhist text. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like that's not important. But I don't see that to be in tension with trying to push students to problem solve and devise arguments that are well crafted, how to use evidence, marshal that evidence in support of particular arguments, and again, to engage in a free-flowing exchange of ideas and that sort of thing. One sort of, again, further observation that I have is that students also are often intimidated by their professors. Not only are they expecting us to give them the information that they will therefore often give back to us, but they often, not only are they resistant to this deeper level of analysis, but they're also not trusting of the classroom setting and environment. So I guess, the first sort of piece of advice, or what I try to keep in mind before I walk into the first day of class, is that I'm really cultivating a classroom culture. So we're not simply It's never stripped down to a kind of utilitarian, even if you're trying to delve into this deeper problem-solving component, where that's all that's going on there. The students are totality of a person. They have their own experiences and backgrounds and information that they're bringing to the table. And I want to create an environment where they feel comfortable speaking and they feel as individuals that they are valued. And if I'm asking them to trust this, again, sort of other layer and other level, this deeper level of what I'm asking them to do with critical inquiry and analysis and so forth, that there has to be this kind of trust and bond nurtured in that environment. So it sounds kind of touchy-feely, but I like to learn their names. I like to welcome them to class. I like to play with space a lot. This is sort of the classic, you're the students, I'm the professor here at the front of the room. I mean, I guess it would be worse if I was standing at the lectern. It would be that notch sort of ratcheted up spatially of the classic student-professor stance. So I like to have activities where the students are actually at the front of the class teaching each other. So I have lots of brainstorming activities, and I pull these out on the first day of class, where I'm receding into the background spatially of the classroom, and one or two or a group of students are in the front of the room. And it's something as simple as just brainstorming what is religion on the first day. So you don't start off with the most intimidating existential questions to throw at them, but just very comfortable, let's just begin to delve into this subject matter. And so I have brainstorming exercises where, again, I will take a seat in the back of the room, and the students are either at the smart room podium or they're up at the dry erase, and they're the ones teaching and engaging in that kind of back and forth. And I like to do that a lot in the class, just play spatially with what's going on there, because those are visual cues and physical cues for how I want to break things up a little bit and cue to them that their ideas and their experiences are significant. Also, one of the assignments that I like to incorporate in my class, and this I guess gets more into the literacy component as well, is a lot of journaling. Especially again in world religion courses, students have particular assumptions and lenses and resistances to learning about other cultures and other religious traditions. And so I have free open questions that I pose to them, usually on Blackboard, sometimes on handouts, where students then are going to compose journal responses to these questions. And I evaluate these journals solely that they have completed them. So I don't even grade them for grammar or punctuation in my lower division courses. It gives them an opportunity, if they're shy or if they might have some particular, again, experience or point of view that they don't feel comfortable voicing, that they have an opportunity to share that with me through journaling. And it's actually quite revelatory. There are times where I've been able to identify problems that a student is having with the content that we're discussing that I would never have known about if it had not been for the journals. And also I want to make it personal. I want to humanize the experience in the classroom as much as I can. So I actually require my world religion students to handwrite the journal entries. I won't accept them typed or printed up. And again, just that they're often so alienated here at the university, they will just as a point of rote put their ID numbers on their assignments. I tell them that's useless information. I don't identify human beings as numbers if I can avoid doing so. Anything that I can do, again, to just foster their trust and open, because I think that's really going to be the basis upon which we're going to have any kind of meaningful conversation or discussion. That's it. Monroe.
Thank you.
Kind of the ethereal, feel good, sorts of stuff. I'm all about that. So, all right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so fostering critical thinking and literacy, I'm kind of going to take a little bit different stance on it. To guide students, this is the way I guide students towards critical thinking in my courses, because I teach teacher candidates, and they have to not only know how to do critical thinking, but they're going to have to create questions and teach the young children how to do critical thinking. So what I do is, first of all, get a professional journal article, and they are to read it, and they're supposed to text code and use margin notes. Now, in all honesty, this first read, the text coding and margin notes is one, to see where they're at on their ability to do that effectively, but also it shows me that, in fact, they did do the first read on the article. The next thing then is I provide the same article with questions that guide their comprehension. Yes?
What is text coding?
Text coding is where you highlight keywords, or you read something and you don't agree with it. When I read something that I don't agree with, I write the word "really" with the question mark in the margin. When there's an author that it's citing, then I write quote, and if it's a book that I want to read, I write book in the margin. So those are some ways to text code and margin notes. It's kind of, text coding and margin notes are the same thing. So, but you bring up a good point, because especially the undergraduates, a lot of them highlight whole sentences, whole paragraphs. And so the first thing, and I do tell them that when I hand them the first article or give them the first article to read, is that they need to quit highlighting whole sentences or whole paragraphs, because that defeats the purpose. The purpose of highlighting is to draw the eye back to that information, and then they can read the information. And so, and for a lot of them, that's like a major aha. So I just tell them, as you're text coding, as you're highlighting, it should just be either a word or a phrase that will, again, draw your attention back to it. So the next thing that I do is provide the same article. And what I do is I put the article in the left column, and then I put the corresponding or adjacent to it, I put the questions that will guide them to process, think about, and further understand or comprehend the material. And we're going to be talking about the different types of questions, in just a moment. But this is just an example of how I do it for them. Okay, so then there's the second round, and the second round is simply you do the same thing all over again. I give them another article, and they are to read it, and then I provide the questions, the article again with the adjacent questions, and they are to respond to the questions. Now, here's the important part, is in order to respond to the questions, they have to read it at least a second time, sometimes more than that. And so they have to understand that you can't do this. You can't answer this level of questions by reading it one time, and you certainly can't create deep, meaningful questions by reading a text one time. So the second round is, again, just like the first round, but it's scaffolding. They're getting used to the different types of questions and being able to answer them. So then the third article, now this is the turning point in the process. They have to read the article, reread it as necessary, and design the questions themselves. And of course provide the answers. And there's several ways I've done that. They can bring back the questions, and then if they get in a trio or in a small group, and they show each other the questions or ask each other the questions and process it together, or they can swap, and their partner answers their questions, they answer their partner's questions. And so then, by that time then, now they're ready to go back to text coding and margin notes, but they're doing it at a different level, because they now have an understanding of what we're talking about, of really processing material and information. So here's some of the types of questions that spark a deeper reading of material or an article. First is how the author uses words, because the author can, and it's interesting because even I don't notice it the first time I read something, but when you read it the second time and more carefully, you'll begin to notice that the author in fact does use words a certain way to influence the reader, to make a point stronger, things like that. Thinking beyond the text naturally is part of it, because it's where they have to read the information, they have to process the information, and then it asks them to think beyond that. Of course, questioning the author is times when they're reading it from their experience, and the more they read in their area of expertise or their area of study, the more they're capable of questioning the author. And we'll see some examples in just a moment. Author's purpose, author's tone. Many journal articles, professional journal articles, you automatically think that it is informational text. However, if you read carefully, you'll find many times that the author does, in fact, try to persuade the reader. And so that's again an example of what is really the author's purpose, or there are several purposes. And then text evidence is about them coming to either the questions they're supposed to respond to in written, or the questions that you're discussing in class, but that they don't just come with their ideas, but they actually can refer back to where they got that idea, what they read in the text, how they combined that information. And so it's not, text evidence isn't just for writing responses to questions, but it's also for bringing text evidence or using text evidence when they're having conversations or discussions in class. Okay, so because you can read and process information a lot quicker than I can explain it, I'm going to let you do so. On the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of different types of questions, and I'll give you a moment to read them, and then we'll go on to another example. So here's examples of author's use of words. Here's an example of thinking beyond the text. Here's another example of thinking beyond the text. Question the author. Critical thinking. Okay, so these are, again, just a few of the types of questions that you can give to the students, and the modeling these type of questions and then actually giving them these prompts will help them when it's their turn to create questions, because they can use these as a jumping off place in creating their questions. The secret to all of this is for them to realize that they have to read a text more than once. And as you can see, there's different reasons why they're going to be reading it more than once during the process. But critical thinking is focused and it's intentional. And your thoughts have to be organized. The students' thoughts have to be organized. They have to be open to other points of view. And critical thinking is informed by evidence. And there sometimes is the crux or the downfall, because oftentimes students do not read to learn. And they have to realize that reading in college is way different than any other kind of reading, that they're actually reading to study. In fact, often in my assignments, instead of saying read this section in the textbook or read this article, I use the word study. Study such and such out of the textbook. The other thing to realize, though, is that writing, normally when we think of writing, we think of, okay, writing to communicate or writing to demonstrate knowledge. But the truth of the matter is, writing to think is very effective and for the students to realize that when they're trying to work through and think through something, whether it is a critical thinking question or whether they're preparing something for class, that actually putting ideas down on paper and then coming back to it and looking at it again. Of course, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know because you've done it many times yourself. It's a natural process for you. The point that I'm making is the students don't realize this. And so sometimes we just have to remind them or enlighten them that this is what college courses are all about. So right now you're probably thinking to yourself, I'm supposed to be teaching them how to read, how to learn, how to think. Well, to that question I answer, if not you and I, then who? So this is just another idea on a way to foster students' critical thinking and literacy. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Monika Gehlawat, and I'm in the English department. Thanks, those were both really interesting talks and gave me stuff to think about. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies in English, but I actually, in thinking about this talk, I'm focusing my remarks on when I teach general education undergraduate classes, because I feel like that's going to have the greatest significance for all of us and is also likely the most challenging in many ways for us. It gets easier and easier the more specialized our teaching gets to be. So I basically have 5 pieces of advice, or maybe a better way to put it is 5 kind of guidelines that I try to employ myself. I'm currently teaching Intro to Fiction, which is a general ed class. The first is that I really think we have to turn the practice of critical thinking back onto ourselves and be really vigilant about the habits that we form as teachers and as how we treat our students and what we think of our students. As the semester wears on, I hear a lot of like, oh, these students are so unprepared, they hate reading, and like, you know, I mean, our default mode, it can be negative. And I try to foster my default mode to be yes, you know, when students say things in class, yes, more, give me more, you know, just to be as positive and welcoming, to engage them when I see them on campus, to chat with them, to memorize their names as quickly as possible, but just to try to break that residual habit of like dissatisfaction and frustration that is so easy for us to feel, because we teach a lot, we're busy, we're trying to do our own work, and you know, some classes fall flat, and I just think that students are incredibly sensitive and they really perceive that mood that we may be conveying non-verbally. So I think it's really important to just be turning the critical eye on ourselves and checking ourselves and rebooting that. So that's the first point I wanted to make. As far as teaching the practice of critical thinking and literacy, I read this really interesting book by Martha Nussbaum this summer called Cultivating Humanity, and it just really influenced some of the ways I had of thinking about why it should even matter to students to do what I'm teaching them to do. And the idea is basically of teaching a sense of citizenship, like a sense of humanity, cultivating a sense of humanity, And I've just found this not only to be like a deeply ethical move, but also one that can apply to any student, no matter what they're doing. Because, you know, when students come into my classroom, if I'm just trying to get them to like become English majors, that's just not going to happen. You know, a lot of people come in knowing exactly what they want to do. They know where they're headed. They're in a certain major to make money or whatever it is. And nor do I want to poo-poo those goals. I mean, everybody has their reasons to study what they're studying. I'm not trying to convert people to study what I study. But I think that if you approach it more in terms of cultivating a sense of humanity, that anybody, no matter what they go on to do, become a mother, become a teacher, become a businessman, then it becomes more of a language that everyone has an investment in speaking. And so in terms of cultivating humanity, the two things that I can do as an English professor, but I imagine everyone in their discipline can find a way to do. One is the idea of developing a narrative imagination. And what that means is basically fostering empathy and curiosity about someone else's story. Okay, so obviously in my field that's easy to model just because we're reading a lot of literature, and I try to expose them to literature from cultures and people and backgrounds they're not familiar with. But one thing I regularly encounter, even on the most quotidian level, a story about a love affair. Well, it happens to be an adulterous love affair, so there's students who are incredibly judgmental. I think adultery is just wrong. She's horrible. She's cheating on him. And I try to say, look, you know, for a minute, pretend you're this character's defense attorney, okay? I'm not saying that you're condoning adultery, but just imagine what the character motivations are here. Imagine why the character is failing in this way or has this particular weakness. And that is part of the steps toward developing narrative imagination. Imagining another person's story, being able to follow that story and its motivations, its consequences in a non-judgmental way. Clearly, we can imagine how for our student population in particular, this also breaks some of the confines of provincialism and gives them access to a much larger worldview where people of different sexualities, people of different cultures and religions and nationalities are all viable, you know, as citizens, just like we are, and that we might be able to imagine supporting them, or at least having some way of understanding why they are the way they are. So that's narrative imagination, which I tie to literacy. But it conveniently works in the service of critical thinking, because the more we empathize with another, the more distanced we become from our own residual ways of thinking. And thus we imagine that they might not be natural, necessary, the only way to think, because we're suddenly amazed that we can put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else. So these two things work in tandem, this kind of tension between how you think of yourself and how much you can empathize with another position. I think that critical thinking as a term can be sort of scary to students because it just sounds so sort of scientific, or it seems like it requires like various steps of like procedure, when on its most fundamental level, the spirit of critical thinking is to sort of be willing to be alienated from yourself and like interrogate yourself, interrogate the ways that you think. There's this really great phrase that Edward Said has, which is about a self-imposed exile, you know, or a willed homelessness. Like, we aren't actually homeless, we aren't actually in exile. Most of us are at home in how we think and act, but if we can impose a kind of exile from that and force ourselves into a position of the other, force ourselves into a position of exile, then we can actually freshen our thinking, okay, while simultaneously imagining somebody else's way of thinking. So to me, being developing literacy works with developing critical thinking. So those are sort of the sort of ethos with which I approach this. Specifically, the two things that are really important to me, and I stress at every level of what I teach, is number one, look for problems, okay? You know, problems in life are things we avoid, but problems in scholarship and in study are actually where the most exciting ideas come from. And I think that, you know, I'm one of the students who went to public high school and was trained to just like find the answer and then have a very consistent like A, B, C, you know, everything proves itself and it turns into this very tidy, repetitive, boring essay, you know. And what's great about looking for problems is that you really encourage your students to believe in themselves, you know? Like, I tell my students, trust your instincts. If you're reading a book and it seems like there's something weird that just happened in a scene, let's talk about it, you know? And it may start as simply as them saying, I hated this character, or I just didn't believe that this would happen. And then to push on that and keep pushing on that and not to run from the problem, you know, but to maybe say like, oh, the problem is where it's at, okay? The problem is where the most exciting, interesting options are for our conversation. It's also great for me because, as some of you may know, the more often you teach things, the more we kind of get into a very like, this is the way it is, right? And if students push against some part of a text that you just haven't been thinking about for years, or raise problems where you have increasingly had blind spots to your thinking, it not only enlivens their experience and gives them a kind of authority that I think Amy was talking about, but it also makes a text new for you. And when that happened for me over the summer, I actually changed a couple of things on my syllabus because I wanted to almost actualize that new experience for myself. So I put like 3 short stories on my syllabus that I had never read before, which is a risk because they might be horrible stories. And then I'm like in the position of defending this. But I told the students, I said, I'm going to read it fresh. You're going to read it fresh. You know, let's come in and tackle it together. And that spirit of collaboration is really welcoming to them, and I think it gives them a kind of agency. And so that would be my 5th point, which is if you meet any of my students, you'll hear them say how annoying it is, but I just push communication so hard. I make participation part of their grade. I basically say, unless you have some sort of debilitating anxiety that keeps you from being able to talk, I expect you to talk. There's any number of ways students can participate in my class. They can read out loud. If they don't feel like they're quick on their feet, they can ask questions. They can make judgmental comments about the text. Like, as long as they're verbalizing what they're thinking, because I'm sure we've all learned that sometimes it's when you say something that you really begin to discover what you're thinking. I mean, that's what therapy is all about, right? Like, say it out loud. So that's something that I cannot stress enough to our students, because unfortunately, not just our population, but the large majority of high school students kind of are in the very passive, like Amy was mentioning, you're a receptacle, and you really lose the ability to cultivate language as a medium of expression, as a medium of care. And I tell them, I say, you know, if it's hard for you to say what you liked about a story because you can't find the words to do it, what are you going to do when you have to tell someone you're in love with them, or you're breaking up with them, or, you know, someone has a horrible disease? Like, life presents us with these incredibly complex problems that we have to tackle no matter what we end up doing after school. And if our ability to communicate has become so impoverished that we can't navigate those situations with any authority, it's really going to be difficult just to be in life, you know? And so that's why I try to like prod them a little bit, you know, and hey, tell me more, what more do you think? And go back and forth a little bit. And I try to model it, you know, myself by engaging them whenever I run into them, inviting them to my office hours, and demonstrating this kind of ongoing conversation we can have about ideas and about our lives in relation to the things we're working on so that it feels more organic. So I've probably gone over my time given my theme, but thank you.